Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to episode 256 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technology firm that helps clients manage risk across four key areas: sales and sales channels, including distributors, resellers, partners, and suppliers, customers, and human capital, employees, and contractors. You can find out more information on the Red Flag Group at www.redflaggroup.com. I'm also pleased to announce that I will be leading 4 Red Flag Group sponsored roundtables in the month of June. These roundtables will be held at the following locations and dates: Atlanta on June 16th, Minneapolis on June 21st, Dallas on June 23rd, and Houston on June 24th. In these roundtables, we're going to take a look at Unaoil and the Panama Papers, how these two events have really changed the shape of due diligence going forward. I think it's going to really demand a significant effort on your part as the compliance practitioner. So I hope you will make some plans to join us on these very interesting case studies. The events are free, but the registration is limited, so you can find out more information on registering and specific details about the venues, times, and locations at www.redflaggroup.com. So I hope you will find this interesting. Today I have with me Alison Taylor. Alison is with the nonprofit, the NGO BSR, and she talks to us about stakeholder trust and measuring stakeholder trust. It's a fascinating podcast. I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, you are in for a real treat, and I am in for a treat, and very pleased to have back with me Alison Taylor. Alison is the Director of Advisory Services at BSR, a nonprofit consultancy and company network focused on sustainability and CSR. She, I was going to say recently, but probably almost a month ago, had a blog post in the FCPA blog entitled, "We Can Use Stakeholder Trust to Measure Integrity." And I was very much fascinated by her insights and wanted to see if she might be able to talk to us about that in the context of Panama Papers, due diligence, perhaps Unaoil, a large lot of concepts that really rolled into her blog post. So with that incredibly long-winded introduction, Alison, welcome back. And why don't you tell us where you are today? Because I think it's a very cool place.
I am in Woodstock, New York, and thanks for having me back, Tom. Because you write so much about rock and roll, I thought that was appropriate, even though people that know the area well will know the festival wasn't actually in Woodstock itself. But it's a beautiful day, and I'm delighted to be talking to you.
Well, thanks very much. So maybe if we could tee this up or set it up a little bit. The Panama Papers, I think most of my listeners are aware of that leak and that bit of information that came out of Panama regarding shell corporations and a Panamanian law firm that facilitated that for several years. So it really threw the light, or a renewed light, I should say, on due diligence, KYC, know your customer, doing background checks, a wide variety of information that companies need to know about the people they're doing business with, whether it's on the sales side of things, such as sales agents, distributors, commissioned resellers, representatives, joint venture partners, etc., and on the supply chain side. But Alison, you took it really, I wouldn't say a completely different way, but had certainly an interesting angle on it, which you talk about as stakeholder trust and measuring stakeholder trust as one of the key indicia of the not only people you're doing business with, but you turn the mirror around and make us look at ourselves. So why don't you explain to us what measuring stakeholder trust is, how do you use it to measure integrity, and how can a compliance practitioner use it?
Sure thing. So, great questions. And before I answer them, I'll just say, with the Panama Papers, there's also been a big data leak from Unaoil. Going back a bit further, we've had WikiLeaks, we've had Edward Snowden. We are in a new era for transparency, and I think developments are getting faster and faster. We would certainly expect to see more of these data leaks in future, and I think there's a new model of whistleblowing, really, that relies on these giant data leaks. So there's a new transparency environment, and I think that we all, including companies, need to respond to that. The second thing that I'm kind of bouncing off of is just the limits and difficulties of conducting FCPA due diligence. And I think I've just spoken to so many compliance officers and so many companies that really don't know how to navigate that space, really don't know how to understand what services are being provided, and really find it very difficult as buyers to establish the value of the various services. So I think that FCPA due diligence approaches need to be looked at in the light of these transparency developments. I think I absolutely would not query the need to do public record research and get independent information from corporate filings, from blacklist checks, from company ownership where it's available, from litigation. The question is what you do when you hit the limits of that. The current approach is to do human source, boots on the ground due diligence, but I think there are a lot of problems with that methodology, not least of which it's not a transparent methodology. And so thinking about how we could use those budgets and use new frameworks that really come from sustainability and particularly mining and oil and gas industries to understand integrity risk in a more measurable and transparent way.
Could you explain a little bit more? I'm writing down the phrase you use, new frameworks from sustainability and transparency. What did you mean by that?
So I think what we might say from a sustainability perspective is that stakeholder engagement, so understanding how a company interacts with its stakeholders, is one of the tools that you can kind of use to understand a variety of things. And I'm arguing we can also use it to understand integrity and corruption risk. So taking a step back for a second, what is a stakeholder? That is usually defined as any group or entity or person that has a stake in a business operation. So the whole kind of idea of maximizing shareholder value is where we are with the private sector in general, but other stakeholders would include your employees, your competitors, your customers, your supply chain, relevant government officials, and the general public. So one way to think about stakeholder trust is that it's another dimension on reputation and reputational risk. But clearly, if you don't engage very well with the list of people and entities I've just put forth to you, you're not going to have a business for very long. So I guess my argument is that if you can understand your interaction and whether you're trusted by the various stakeholders that have an interest in your business, you will get competitor insight, you will get a measure of trust, and you will have a much more detailed understanding of the system that you operate in, which is particularly relevant for high-risk emerging markets.
Alison, in your article, you also talk about measuring stakeholder trust. Could you give us some insights or thoughts on how a company might go about measuring stakeholder trust?
Sure. So first of all, I think companies have to identify their stakeholders and think about who their stakeholders are. So that's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. A lot of human rights frameworks consider, everyone that a company impacts, regardless of that person's ability to impact the company's interest. Most stakeholder engagement approaches consider issues of kind of risk and influence and impact. So the first stage is to figure out who your stakeholders are and what sentiment you want to measure. And then from there, I think this is an area that we are seeing a huge amount of activity in innovation and entrepreneurship in. So there are two kind of main streams. There are tools that have historically been used to measure community engagement and social license to operate around mining and oil and gas projects. And obviously those projects have a huge effect on the communities they sit in. So those companies, for better or worse, and driven by the risk environment, tend to have a fairly sophisticated understanding of kind of the stakeholders around their project and how to measure and think about that concept of social license. The second area where there is a ton of innovation, some of which is in the FCPA due diligence space, some of which is more kind of sentiment analysis and macro risk driven, is in social media and big data and sentiment analysis. So I think there are two kind of areas where there are powerful tools already in existence already. They haven't yet been kind of applied systematically to concepts of integrity, risk, and corruption. But I am arguing that applying those concepts might be more effective than the boots on the ground confidential source inquiries, which are the standard approach right now.
The thing that I find really interesting about this is, I might say I would certainly still advocate a boots on the ground, but I see this as really opening up an entire new dialogue between corporations and their third parties in a wide variety of areas, and leading to something that I really want to ask you about, which is one paragraph you, and we could probably do an entire podcast on this, but you end this paragraph by saying, corruption fundamentally shifts the terms of engagement with stakeholders. And you give certain examples of that, but I see indeed just by measuring stakeholder trust, you're going to force a dialogue between a wide variety of groups that perhaps not have been in dialogue before. Is that, you see any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree with you that a boots on the ground, kind of going beyond the public record, going beyond research, going beyond what's in databases is absolutely needed. So then the question is what you do and how you measure a company's role in society. So I totally agree with you. It does open up a lot of kind of wider questions, and it also means that companies can use the stakeholder trust tool to consider issues in their supply chain. You've got the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. You've got a lot more focus coming up on human rights in the supply chain, labor rights, kind of various abuses that have been going on, and companies are really, really struggling to tackle this as well with kind of traditional supplier audits. So by thinking about the level of trust that your suppliers have, and the level of trust that the general public and customers and relevant government officials and employees have in you, I think you can hit a lot of birds with one stone. And what's notable at the moment is you've got a kind of, very often in a lot of companies, a supply chain responsibility conversation going on and an anti-corruption compliance conversation going on. And they're sometimes linked, but not always. And I'm arguing that a concept of stakeholder trust and managing it and measuring it is more transparent than what's being done at the moment, and would potentially be very powerful and allow companies to address not just corruption and integrity risks, but human rights, labor rights, maybe health and safety standards, a whole spectrum of corporate responsibility. And given how much is being spent on these areas where we can find synergies, I think that's a very, very good thing. And I'm also saying that corrupt companies, by definition, don't often have a very high regard for human rights, labor standards, employee welfare, etc.
I'm a big advocate of, and in fact, one of the things I say is that compliance, or at least anti-corruption compliance, is in many ways a business solution to a legal problem of the FCPA or other laws. Yet this approach really takes it, I think, um, not only steps beyond it, but also it incorporates the business approach, because a business who uses this approach can have a measuring tool to evaluate who they're doing business with, protect themselves from reputational damage. And then if I could maybe turn to the final point, which I found equally fascinating, is, and I'll just read your last paragraph because I found it so powerful. Perhaps even more importantly, companies need to understand their own level of stakeholder trust in their markets of operation and use this insight to drive strategy, as well as identify integrity hotspots that might be missed by the internal compliance process. And I certainly understand kind of the non-business need, if I could put it that way, to have an understanding of this information. But when I saw that paragraph, Alison, it jumped out to me as a way for corporations to understand their markets and their marketplaces, and to be able to deliver a much more targeted product or service to those markets through this type of dialogue.
Absolutely. And I think, there are so many powerful ways to think about kind of mapping stakeholders in a market, and it can be very sort of risk driven. What you will see very often in a very high risk market is perhaps your competitor has a really close relationship or a conflict of interest type relationship with a government official, and you can have as good product as you like, you're never going to win that market. So considering the relationships between the third parties you do business with and the other people you care about, and being able to sort of map them out and understand your position, you can see the nodes of power, you can see the nodes of risk, you can understand how you might need to sort of adjust your business strategy. And I absolutely agree with you. I think these kind of tools, whatever they are only effective when they consider the commercial context and when they also have something to say about strategy. And so this would be, another potential solution there. And I've done work like this in the past, for example, mapping a company's distributors in a certain sector in Russia, understanding their relationships with each other, understanding their relationships with competitors and other government officials. And it's a very powerful tool to see where the points of risk are in your supply chain and from an FCPA point of view. So both compliance risk and operational risk and commercial risk.
Well, Alison, unfortunately, we're nearing the end of our time. I think we could probably, or I could go on quite a bit longer, but I was wondering if anyone wanted to contact you directly to get more information on the stakeholder trust issue, or even the measuring stakeholder trust. Could they email you? And if so, how would they do it?
They sure can. My email address is ataylor@bsr.org. That's Business for Social Responsibility. I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. So thanks again for having me. It was always great to talk to you.
Alison, thanks very much. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Take care, Tom. Bye-bye.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I hope you will take Alison up on her offer to engage more on her topic of measuring stakeholder trust. I think it's an excellent resource, and she can give you a lot of good pointers, hints. She's done this in something right in her wheelhouse. I'd also like to invite you once again to join me at the Red Flag Group Roundtables in Atlanta on June 16th, Minneapolis June 21st, Dallas June 23rd, and Houston June 24th. These will be very informative. We're going to go through the life cycle of third-party management and how the Unaoil and Panama Papers case have changed due diligence probably for quite some time. You can get more information on them at the Red Flag Group website, which is, amazingly enough, www.theredflaggroup.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again.